In the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, where danger lurked behind every shadow, and survival demanded both courage and cunning, one woman's extraordinary journey defied all expectations. This is the remarkable story of Eleanor Reed, a young expectant mother who witnessed the brutal ambush of her wagon train, escaped by hiding in a wolf's den, and found herself forming an unlikely alliance with Caleb Blackwood, a reclusive trapper, consumed by his quest for vengeance. For nearly a year, Eleanor navigated two worlds, the desperate fight for survival and the burning need for justice, while preparing to bring new life into a landscape defined by death. Join us as we uncover this astonishing tale of tragedy, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of a woman who found strength in the most unlikely sanctuary while carrying the most precious cargo of all, her unborn child. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring of 1859 dawned with promise across the American frontier. As tensions between North and South simmered in distant cities, a different kind of hope drove countless families westward toward the Oregon Territory. The whispered tales of fertile valleys, abundant game, and land free for the claiming pulled like a magnet on those seeking to build something lasting from nothing but sweat and determination. Among those dreamers were the Reeds, Eleanor and William, a young couple from western Pennsylvania who had sold their struggling blacksmith shop after 3 lean years. At 24, Eleanor possessed a quiet resilience beneath her warm smile and hazel eyes. The daughter of a schoolteacher, she carried books among their precious belongings and read by firelight each evening, one hand often resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen, their first child due in early autumn. William Reed stood tall and broad-shouldered at 29, with a craftsman's calloused hands and an optimist's unwavering faith in tomorrow. The son of a failed farmer, he had learned the blacksmith trade as an apprentice and dreamed of establishing a shop in a growing settlement where his skills would be valued and well compensated. The Oregon Territory, with its expanding communities and constant need for metalwork, seemed the perfect canvas for their future. "Our child will be born on free soil," William would say, his hand covering Eleanor's atop her growing belly. With room to run and grow beneath open skies, they joined the Miller-Donovan wagon train, a company of 17 families gathered in St. Joseph, Missouri. 68 souls bound together by shared dreams and the practical reality that the dangers of the trail demanded numbers. Jacob Miller, a veteran of 2 previous crossings, served as wagon master, his experience evident in the efficient way he organized the party and established rules for travel. 3 miles on a good day, he explained during their first gathering. Maybe 15 on flat ground with favorable conditions. We stick together. We reach Oregon before the mountain passes snow over. The Reed's wagon was positioned 10th in the line, between the Parkers with their 4 young children and the elderly Whitman couple who had sold their Ohio farm to join their married daughter already settled in Oregon. Eleanor quickly formed friendships with Mary Parker and Abigail Whitman, the 3 women sharing recipes and stories as wheels creaked westward across the rolling plains. By early May, they had crossed the swollen Missouri River and were making steady progress along. The Platte, following the same trail thousands before them, had worn into the earth. Eleanor kept a careful journal of their journey, recording daily distances, notable landmarks, and small moments of beauty amidst the challenges. A field of wildflowers swaying in the prairie breeze, the majesty of a buffalo herd moving like a dark sea across the horizon, the simple pleasure of bread baked in a Dutch oven beneath frontier stars. "I want our child to know the journey that brought them to their home," she explained to William as she wrote by lantern light. "Every mile traversed before their first breath." As May turned to June, the terrain grew more challenging. The flat, prairie gave way to rolling hills and rocky outcroppings as they approached Wyoming territory. Game became more plentiful, but so too did the dangers. 2 wagons lost wheels on treacherous descents. A child fell ill with fever that swept through 3 families before subsiding. Reports from passing riders suggested increased tension with the Shoshone and Cheyenne, whose traditional hunting grounds they now crossed. Jacob Miller took these warnings seriously, doubling the night watch and instructing the company to form a tighter circle each evening. "We respect their land," he told the gathered travelers, "and we protect our own." Eleanor's pregnancy progressed, her body changing as the landscape around her transformed. The child moved vigorously now, especially in the evenings, as if already eager to explore the world beyond the womb. William crafted a small wooden cradle from timber gathered along the trail, working on it during evening stops, his blacksmith's hands surprisingly delicate with the carving knife. "Our little wildcat," he called their unborn child, already fighting to see what's over the next ridge. On June 18th, as they made camp in a sheltered valley along a clear-running creek in eastern Wyoming, Eleanor sat with Mary Parker, mending a torn shirt and watching clouds gather on the western horizon. The late afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows across the circled wagons. "Looks like rain tonight," Mary observed, glancing toward the darkening sky. Eleanor nodded, wincing slightly, as the baby delivered a particularly energetic kick. "This little one doesn't care for thunder. Goes to war with my ribs whenever a storm approaches." What neither woman could have known, what none of them suspected, was that the true storm approaching had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the band of 12 men who had been tracking the wagon train for the past 3 days. The Harlow gang consisted of deserters, fugitives, and opportunists drawn together in the lawless spaces of the frontier. Led by Frank Harlow, a former Army officer dishonorably discharged for brutality toward indigenous peoples, they had already robbed 2 stagecoaches and raided a small settlement near Fort Laramie, leaving few survivors to identify them. Now, aware that the Miller-Donovan party carried collective funds for establishing new homesteads, they had marked the wagon train as their next target. The attack came at dawn on June 19th. The night guards had just changed shifts, the relief men still rubbing sleep from their eyes when the first shots cracked across the quiet camp. Eleanor jolted awake beside William, who immediately reached for the rifle kept loaded beside their bedroll. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. "Stay in the wagon no matter what happens." Through the canvas covering, Eleanor could hear shouting, more gunfire, the terrified screams of children. William lifted the rifle and moved toward the wagon's opening. He managed to fire twice before a bullet tore through the canvas and struck him in the chest. Eleanor watched in horror as her husband fell backward, his eyes finding hers one last time before the light in them faded. Terror froze her for precious seconds before survival instinct took over. Grabbing William's hunting knife from his belt, she crouched low in the wagon as heavy footsteps approached. When the canvas flap was ripped aside, she lunged forward with the blade, catching her attacker across the forearm. He howled in pain and rage, raising his pistol toward her. In that moment, the baby kicked hard within her, and Eleanor did the only thing she could. She dove from the opposite side of the wagon, tumbling painfully onto the ground. A bullet splintered wood where she had been crouching seconds before. Keeping low, she crawled beneath the wagon, then between the spoked wheels of the next, her pregnant body making the movement awkward, but desperation lending her speed. Chaos enveloped the camp. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Jacob Miller. By the main fire, Mary Parker shielding her youngest child, William half visible in their wagon's opening. The attackers moved methodically from family to family, shooting those who resisted, taking valuables, occasionally arguing over items of particular worth. Eleanor kept moving, her breathing shallow, one hand protectively curved around her belly. The creek that had provided their evening water now offered the only visible escape route. Its banks, lined with thick brush, might provide cover if she could reach them. 20 yards of open ground stood between her current position and that potential safety. With the Harlow gang distracted by looting, she gathered herself and ran, awkward, hunched, terrified, toward the vegetation. She had nearly reached the creekside when a shout went up behind her. "There! Woman running!" Eleanor didn't look back. She plunged into the brush, branches scratching her face and arms as she pushed deeper into the thicket. The sound of pursuit drove her forward, terror lending strength to her exhausted body. The creek bed descended into a ravine, the morning light barely penetrating the dense foliage. She stumbled down the increasingly steep slope, one hand bracing against tree trunks for balance, the other never leaving her swollen abdomen. A bullet splintered bark inches from her head. Another sang through leaves nearby. Eleanor kept moving, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs trembling with exertion. The ravine deepened, the terrain growing rockier. Ahead, a shadowed opening appeared in a limestone outcropping, a small cave or hollow in the ravine wall. Without hesitation, Eleanor squeezed into the opening, finding it larger than it first appeared, a proper cave extending several feet into the hillside. She pressed herself as far back as possible, the coolness of stone against her back, William's knife clutched in white-knuckled fingers before her. Only then did she register the musky animal scent and the soft sounds deeper within the cave. Slowly, her eyes adjusted to the dimness. 10 feet away, amber eyes reflected what little light filtered through the entrance. A wolf, large, grey and watchful, observed her from a depression in the cave floor. Beside her, 3 small pups huddled, barely visible in the shadows. Eleanor's heart, already racing, seemed to stop entirely. The she-wolf growled, a low rumble of warning. Death waited in either direction, men with guns outside, fangs and claws within. The baby kicked against her ribs, as if reminding her what she fought for. Keeping the knife ready, but making no threatening moves, Eleanor spoke in a whisper. "I won't harm your children if you don't harm mine," whether from the quiet tone or some recognition of another mother's desperation. The wolf's growl subsided. She remained alert, but made no move to attack, her attention divided between the human intruder and the sounds of men crashing through brush outside. "Check that cave," a gruff voice called, much closer than Eleanor had realized. She pressed deeper, into the shadows, willing her breathing to quiet, her presence to vanish. The wolf's ears pricked forward, her body tensing as footsteps approached the entrance. A man's silhouette blocked the meager light, his frame filling the narrow opening. "Can't see a damn thing in here," he muttered, leaning forward slightly. The she-wolf chose that moment to deliver a warning more effective than Eleanor could have managed. A snarl ripped through the darkness, vicious and primal. The man jerked backward with a curse. "Wolf den!" he shouted to his companions. "Big one, too." "Forget it then," came the reply. "We got what we came for. No woman's worth tangling with a wolf." The footsteps receded, voices growing fainter as the bandits returned to their plundering. Eleanor remained motionless, tears streaming silently down her face, uncertainty keeping her rooted despite the predator sharing her sanctuary. Minutes stretched painfully before she dared believe they had truly abandoned the search. The wolf watched her, amber eyes unblinking in the dimness. Outside, smoke began to rise as the attackers set fire to wagons before departing. Eleanor could smell it even in the cave, the acrid scent of burning canvas, wood, and possessions, lives reduced to ash. For hours, she remained in that strange standoff with the wolf, neither advancing nor retreating. The animal seemed to recognize that this human posed no immediate threat to her pups, while Eleanor understood that any sudden movement might change that assessment. Exhaustion eventually overcame terror, and Eleanor drifted into a fitful doze, jolting awake at every sound from outside. By late afternoon, silence had fallen over the ravine. The wolf had relaxed somewhat, lying beside her pups, but maintaining her watchful gaze on the human intruder. Hunger and thirst began to gnaw at Eleanor, reminding her that survival required more than hiding. The child within her demanded nourishment. With excruciating slowness, she edged toward the cave entrance, expecting the wolf to object. The animal tensed, but made no move to stop her. At the opening, Eleanor paused, scanning the terrain before, carefully emerging into the late afternoon light. The scene that greeted her was desolation itself. Smoke still rose from the remains of the wagon train, black columns against the blue Wyoming sky. Bodies lay where they had fallen, belongings scattered across the ground. No movement, no survivors, no mercy had been shown. Grief threatened to overwhelm her, but the practical demands of survival kept her moving. She needed water, food, anything useful that might have escaped the destruction. Keeping one hand on her belly, as if to reassure the child within that they would endure this, Eleanor made her way carefully back to the ruined camp. She found a canteen, miraculously intact, beside one of the bodies. Water from the creek would fill it. A small sack of cornmeal had spilled, but not burned. A knife better than William's, a blanket only partially scorched, a tinderbox, and a small cooking pot joined her salvage. From her own wagon, now a blackened skeleton, she recovered her journal, its edges singed but the contents mostly preserved. As the sun began to set, Eleanor faced the first of many impossible choices. She could not remain here among the dead, but where could a woman alone and heavily pregnant hope to find safety? The nearest settlement lay over 100 miles east, the next planned stop on their journey at least 60 miles ahead. Either direction meant days of travel on foot through territory haunted by both human predators and natural dangers. The practical reality was that she needed shelter for the night before any longer journey could be contemplated. The cave with its wolf occupant appeared the only option, dangerous as it was. Eleanor filled the canteen from the creek, gathered her meager supplies, and with a silent apology to the dead she was leaving unburied, made her way back to the ravine. She-Wolf was gone when Eleanor returned to the cave, though the pups remained huddled in their depression. Evidently hunger had driven the mother out to hunt. This presented both opportunity and danger. Eleanor could establish herself more securely in the cave without immediately confronting the wolf. But the animal's return would inevitably bring a new reckoning. She used the remaining daylight to make the space as defensible as possible. A small fire near the entrance would provide warmth and help deter both the wolf and other predators. The knives placed within easy reach might offer some protection. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders offered minimal comfort against the growing chill. As darkness fell completely, Eleanor opened her journal and by firelight recorded the day's horrors with a shaking hand. The familiar action helped steady her, transforming overwhelming emotion into words that could be contained on a page. The final entry read simply, "William is gone, all are gone, but the child lives, we live, and so we must continue." The she-wolf returned near midnight, a rabbit hanging limp from her jaws. She froze at the cave entrance, clearly startled by the fire and the human's continued presence. Eleanor remained still, knife ready, but making no threatening moves. After a tense standoff, the wolf circled wide around the fire and carried her prize to the pups, who greeted her with eager whimpers. Eleanor watched as the mother wolf fed her, young, tearing small pieces of meat for pups still learning to chew. The simple devotion of the act brought fresh tears. This wild creature and she were not so different, both fighting to sustain the lives that depended on them. Both now without the protection of a mate, vulnerable in a world designed to eliminate vulnerability. "We have that in common," she whispered, one hand on her belly. "Everything for them." The wolf's ears flicked toward her voice, amber eyes reflecting firelight. There was no understanding in that gaze, no sentimentality, only the cold calculation of a predator assessing threat. Yet something in the animal's measured restraint gave Eleanor the first fragile thread of hope she had felt since the attack. If this most feared of creatures could share space rather than attack, perhaps survival was possible after all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, food to find, decisions about direction, the inescapable reality of a child who would soon enter this harsh world. But for tonight, in this strange sanctuary, Eleanor Reed allowed exhaustion to claim her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As she drifted towards sleep, the baby kicked strongly against her palm. "Yes," she murmured, "we're still here, both of us." Outside, a distant howl rose into the night sky, another wolf calling to the one who shared Eleanor's reluctant shelter. The she-wolf's answering call vibrated through the small cave, mournful yet powerful. A proclamation of continued existence against all hardship. Eleanor understood the sentiment perfectly. Dawn arrived with a soft glow that belied the harshness of Eleanor's circumstances. She woke stiff and aching, momentarily confused by the stone beneath her and the unfamiliar sounds echoing through the cave. Reality rushed back as her eyes focused on the she-wolf and her pups in the deeper shadows. The animal regarded her with that same measured wariness, neither aggressive nor welcoming. "Another day," Eleanor whispered, one hand automatically finding her swollen belly. The child within shifted, a reassuring movement that provided more comfort than any words could offer. Her immediate concerns were painfully practical: water, food, and determining a course of action. The creek provided the first necessity, though approaching it meant leaving the relative safety of the cave. Eleanor gathered the canteen and moved cautiously toward the entrance, watching the wolf for any sign of aggression. The animal made no move to stop her, though amber eyes tracked her every movement. Outside, morning light revealed details missed in yesterday's panic. The ravine descended more gradually than she had thought, widening as it followed the creek's path. Dense vegetation provided cover, while occasional limestone outcroppings suggested other potential shelters if the wolf decided human company was no longer tolerable. Eleanor filled the canteen and washed her face in the cool water. Dried, blood and tear tracks giving way to pale skin marked by scratches from her desperate flight. The practical action steadied her, as did the mental inventory of her situation. She possessed one blanket, 2 knives, a canteen, a small cooking pot, a tinderbox, a sack of cornmeal, and her journal with a stub of pencil. She wore a calico dress, now torn and stained, sturdy boots and a wool shawl. Around her neck hung a locket containing a small portrait of William, painted during their engagement. What she lacked was far more substantial: proper tools, adequate food, weapons, medical supplies for her eventual childbirth, transportation, and perhaps most critically, human companionship in a landscape where isolation often meant death. The urge to simply follow the creek downstream was powerful. Water meant life, and waterways often led to settlements. Yet Eleanor hesitated. The Harlow gang had headed west after the massacre, the same direction the wagon train had been traveling. East meant retracing the journey already made, potentially hundreds of miles on foot through terrain that had been challenging enough with wagons and oxen. "What would you do?" she asked her unborn child, a habit developed over months of travel. Follow the water and hope, or wait and gather strength? The baby's kick seemed to emphasize the importance of the decision. Eleanor knew her condition made long-distance travel dangerous, particularly alone. She was approximately 7 months pregnant. Time remained before birth would force immobility, but not much. Whatever choice she made needed to account for that inevitable reality, A sound from above the ravine interrupted her deliberations, the distant clop of hooves on rocky ground. Eleanor froze, then quickly moved back into the shelter of overhanging vegetation. Riders soon after the attack could easily be the returning Harlow gang or other opportunists drawn by the smoke of the burning wagons. Through gaps in the leaves, she glimpsed two mounted figures on the ridge above, men with rifles moving cautiously toward the massacre site. Their dress suggested hunters or trappers rather than bandits, but experience had taught her bitter caution. She remained motionless until they passed from view, then returned to the cave to gather her few possessions. Her immediate safety demanded movement. If those men discovered the wagon train's remains, they might search the surrounding areas thoroughly. The cave with its wolf occupants no longer offered sufficient security. Eleanor packed her meager supplies into a rough bundle fashioned from the blanket. To the she-wolf, who watched with alert interest, she offered a simple nod. "Your den saved." "My life," she said quietly. "I won't forget that." Following the ravine seemed the wisest course, using its natural concealment while she assessed her situation more thoroughly. Eleanor moved carefully downstream, the creek's gentle gurgle masking her footsteps. The narrow valley gradually widened, its slopes becoming less steep as the wilderness unfolded around her. June heat intensified as morning progressed, humidity rising from the creek to create a sticky warmth that clung to her skin. Eleanor paused, frequently to rest, rationing sips from her canteen and small handfuls of dry cornmeal. The child within her grew increasingly active, as if protesting the meager sustenance or perhaps the constant movement. "I know," she soothed, resting against a fallen log. "We'll find something better soon." By midday, hunger had become a persistent gnawing beneath her ribs. The cornmeal could sustain her temporarily, but provided inadequate nutrition for both her and the developing child. Eleanor knew the surrounding forest offered food. William had often hunted successfully during their journey west, but her own knowledge of edible plants was limited, and she lacked tools for hunting. A flash of movement caught her eye, a rabbit darting between bushes near the creek. The sight reminded her of the wolf's successful hunt the previous night. If a wolf could feed her young, surely a human mother could manage the same. Eleanor studied the surrounding vegetation with new purpose, recalling conversations with native women they had encountered during their journey. Abigail Parker had traded buttons for knowledge about wild foods and had shared the information during evening gatherings around the wagons. Wild onions often grew near waterways. Certain berries could be recognized by their leaf patterns. Cattails provided edible roots if one knew how to prepare them. Eleanor began moving more deliberately, eyes scanning the creek banks for these potential resources. Near a bend where the water pooled before continuing its journey, green shoots broke through the rich soil, wild onions, their distinctive aroma releasing as she carefully extracted several from the ground. Further exploration yielded a patch of strawberries, tiny but intensely flavorful, and a cluster of mushrooms she recognized from previous meals prepared by the wagon train's more knowledgeable members. These small discoveries lifted Eleanor's spirits. She gathered her findings into the cooking pot and continued downstream, moving with growing confidence. The ravine gradually gave way to more open woodland, the creek widening into a proper stream lined with reeds and occasional sandy banks. As afternoon waned, Eleanor's pregnant body demanded rest more insistently. She had traveled perhaps 3 miles from the cave, not far in normal circumstances, but significant given her condition and the rough terrain. Finding a sheltered spot beneath a rocky overhang, she gathered wood for a small fire, using the tinderbox to bring a spark to life. The simple act of building fire, a human achievement, a marker of civilization, steadied her. With water from the stream and her gathered ingredients, she prepared a thin soup in the cooking pot, the wild onions and mushrooms transforming the plain cornmeal into something approaching nourishment. The berries provided a sweet conclusion to this modest meal. As dusk approached, Eleanor reinforced her shelter, gathering additional branches to create a partial screen across the opening of the overhang. The night would be uncomfortable but survivable, the fire providing warmth, the stone at her back offering protection from at least one direction. Opening her journal, she recorded the day's journey and discoveries, adding small sketches of plants she had identified. The methodical documentation helped organize her thoughts and preserve knowledge that might prove crucial in days ahead. "We made our first steps alone," she wrote. "Each day must build upon the last until we find our way back to civilization. The child grows stronger. I feel its movements more distinctly now, as if it senses the change in our circumstances and wishes to remind me of our shared purpose." Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the persistent discomfort of stone beneath her blanket. Dreams mixed memory and fear, William's smile transforming into his dying gaze, wagon wheels becoming spinning rifle barrels, wolves running alongside oxen across endless plains. Eleanor woke before dawn, momentarily disoriented until the weight of her belly and the dying embers of her fire anchored her to reality. The second day established patterns that would sustain her through the week that followed. Each morning began with gathering water and rekindling fire. Food collection became increasingly systematic as she learned to identify more edible plants and occasionally succeeded in trapping small animals using snares constructed from fibers. Unraveled from her blanket's edge, she followed the stream consistently, marking her journal with crude maps and notable landmarks. The terrain gradually changed, forest giving way to more open meadows, interspersed with stands of pine and aspen. Game became more plentiful, deer coming to drink at the widening stream, grouse nesting in underbrush, fish darting in deeper pools. Eleanor developed tools from materials at hand, a fishing spear fashioned from a straight branch and one of her knives, a basket woven from reeds to carry gathered foods, a shelter design that improved with each new location. The skills emerged, partly from necessity, partly from fragmented memories of indigenous techniques observed during the westward journey. Each small adaptation built upon previous knowledge, transforming this city-raised blacksmith's wife into something new. Not yet skilled in wilderness survival, but no longer helpless before its challenges. The transformation was both physical and psychological, her hands toughening, her senses sharpening, her confidence growing in measured increments. On the fourth day, she encountered evidence of human presence. An old campsite with a stone-ringed fire pit and crude lean-to. Hope flared briefly before she recognized the signs of abandonment. Sapling poles grayed with exposure, ash long cold in the fire circle. Still, the discovery provided both practical benefit and psychological encouragement. Others had passed this way and survived. The lean-to, though deteriorating, offered better shelter than she had managed to construct herself. Eleanor spent 2 nights at this site, using the respite to rest her increasingly weary body and improve her toolkit. From the remnants of the lean-to, she salvaged usable wood to create a more effective spear and a walking stick that provided welcome support for her growing burden. The established fire pit allowed her to build a larger blaze than she had previously dared, thoroughly cooking a rabbit caught in one of her snares. These small comforts reinforced a growing realization, while returning to civilization remained. Her ultimate goal, immediate survival, required embracing rather than fighting against the wilderness. Each skill mastered, each successful meal prepared, each comfortable night's rest achieved, represented a victory against the circumstances that should have claimed her life alongside William's. On the 7th day after the massacre, as Eleanor followed the stream around a sweeping bend, the landscape opened dramatically before her. The waterway widened into a proper river, flowing through a broad valley flanked by distant mountains. Meadows rich with summer grasses stretched toward, stands of pine and aspen that climbed the lower slopes. The sight was breathtaking, both in its beauty and in the daunting expansion of scale it represented. Following this river would eventually lead to settlements, Eleanor felt certain. But the vastness of the landscape emphasized the enormity of that journey. Alone, on foot, and advancing in pregnancy, she might walk for weeks without encountering another human being. The child within her, growing heavier and more active each day, would not wait for convenient timing or location. Reality demanded acknowledgement. She needed to prepare for the possibility of giving birth in the wilderness. The thought terrified her in ways that wolves and bandits had not. Childbirth under ideal circumstances carried significant risks. Facing it alone, without medical assistance or even basic comforts, approached a death sentence for mother, child, or both. Eleanor settled on the river bank, watching the water flow past as she considered her options. Continuing to follow the river remained logical, but perhaps a more permanent camp would serve her better than constant movement. This valley offered abundant resources: water, diverse plant life, plentiful game, natural materials for improved shelter construction. If she established a secure position, perhaps others would eventually pass by. Trappers, hunters, even indigenous peoples who might offer assistance. The decision crystallized gradually as Eleanor surveyed her surroundings, with increasingly practical eyes. Near where the stream joined the larger river, a rocky outcropping created a natural windbreak. Several large pines provided potential overhead shelter. The river narrows offered fishing opportunities, while the meadow's edge harbored numerous plants she had learned to recognize as food sources. "This is where we wait," she told her unborn child, hands resting on her abdomen. "This is where we prepare." Over the next 5 days, Eleanor constructed the most substantial shelter she had attempted since the massacre. Using techniques observed in both settler and indigenous constructions, she created a lean-to against the rock face, its frame built from saplings lashed together with plant fibers, its sides reinforced with pine boughs layered like shingles, its floor cushioned with grass dried in the summer sun. Inside this crude but effective structure, she established a sleeping area padded with additional dried grass and lined with pine needles for their pleasant scent and insect-repelling properties. Outside, a stone-ringed fire pit provided cooking capabilities and protection from evening chill. She constructed a simple rack for drying meat and fish, increasing her ability to preserve food resources. Each improvement built upon the last, the shelter evolving from immediate necessity to something approaching modest comfort. Eleanor worked methodically, resting frequently as her pregnancy advanced. The child's movements remained strong and regular, reassuring her of its continued health despite their circumstances. Her journal entries during this period reflected both growing confidence and persistent concerns. Day 12 since the attack. The shelter withstood last night's rain without leaking. Found a patch of wild raspberries half a mile upriver. The tartness satisfies some craving I couldn't identify before. The walking stick helps with balance as the child grows heavier. My data. Back aches constantly now. Day 15. Finished the smoking rack and prepared my first batch of river fish. The preservation technique seems successful, though the flavor is stronger than I would prefer. Created a calendar system on the shelter's support post, notching each passing day. By my calculation, the child should arrive in approximately 7 weeks, though first babies often come late, according to Abigail Whitman's experienced assessment. Day 18. Spotted a deer and her fawn across the river this morning. They reminded me that new life emerges even in harsh circumstances. My preparations for the birth continue slowly. Gathered soft moss for padding and clean river stones to heat. Water, created swaddling material by unraveling the less necessary portions of my shawl and reweaving the yarn. Still lacked proper cutting implements for the birthing itself. Eleanor's physical transformation continued alongside these practical adaptations. Her city softness had given way to leaner muscle and sun-darkened skin. Her hands, once kept relatively smooth through William's insistence on using homemade balms, now showed calluses from constant work with wood, fibre and stone. Her hair, previously kept neatly pinned beneath a bonnet, hung in a simple braid down her back, streaked with lighter highlights from sun exposure. More profound were the psychological changes. The initial shock and grief had not diminished, but had been channeled into purposeful action. Eleanor spoke aloud frequently, sometimes to her unborn child, sometimes to William's memory, sometimes simply to hear a human voice in the vast silence. These one-sided conversations helped clarify her thoughts and maintain a connection to her humanity amid the solitude. On the 21st day after the massacre, Eleanor's carefully established routine was disrupted by an unexpected visitor. She had been gathering reeds near the river's edge when movement on the opposite bank caught her attention. A bear, cinnamon-colored and substantial, emerged from the tree line to drink from the water. Eleanor froze, her heart racing as she assessed her vulnerability. The shelter lay 30 yards behind her, the crude spear leaning beside its entrance. The river provided separation, but she knew bears swam readily if motivated. Her pregnant state made rapid movement impossible. For several tense minutes, she remained motionless as the bear drank its fill, then foraged along the shoreline, occasionally glancing across the water without apparent concern for her presence. Eventually, it ambled back into the forest, leaving Eleanor shaking with unreleased tension. The encounter forced a re-evaluation of her situation. While her adaptation to wilderness living had progressed remarkably, she remained vulnerable to predators larger than those she could manage with snares and fishing spears. The bear's appearance, while peaceful, emphasized a sobering truth. Her survival thus owed as much to good fortune as to developing skills. That evening, beside her small fire, Eleanor reviewed her journal entries since the massacre. The progression was evident, from desperate flight to basic survival to increasingly competent adaptation. Yet the coming challenge of childbirth remained, as did the fundamental isolation that made every small setback potentially catastrophic. "We have come far," she wrote in her journal that night, "but not yet far enough. The child will come whether we are ready or not. I must balance preparation with continued efforts to find assistance. Tomorrow I will climb to higher ground and search for signs of settlements or travelers. The universe cannot be so cruel as to bring us this far, only to abandon us in our moment of greatest need." As she closed the journal, a distant howl echoed. Across the valley, a wolf's call rising into the darkening sky. Eleanor listened intently, wondering if the sound came from the she-wolf who had shared her first night of survival. The answering chorus suggested a pack roaming the higher elevations beyond the valley. Their voices, wild and free in the gathering darkness, struck Eleanor as neither threatening nor comforting, simply a reminder that life persisted in many forms across this vast landscape. Her own persistence, against odds that should have broken her, had transformed her from victim to survivor. What further transformation the coming weeks might bring remained uncertain, but she would face it with the same determination that had carried her this far. Eleanor placed a hand on her rounded abdomen, feeling the strong kick of the child within. "We are still here," she whispered, echoing words spoken in a wolf's den 3 weeks earlier. "Both of us, still here." The fire crackled in response, sparks rising toward stars emerging in the deepening twilight. Another day of survival is complete, another night to endure before continuing the journey neither of them had chosen, but both were determined to survive. Morning arrived with a clarity that Eleanor had come to recognize as preceding significant change. The air felt sharper, colors more vivid, sounds carrying further across the valley. She rose from her bed of dried grass and stepped outside the lean-to, studying the landscape with experienced eyes that had learned to read nature's subtle warnings. The river flowed quietly, its surface unruffled by wind. Birds called normally from nearby trees, yet something felt different, a tension she couldn't immediately identify, but had learned to respect. 24 days had passed since the massacre. In that time, Eleanor had become attuned to the wilderness in ways she would once have considered impossible. As promised in her journal entry, today she would climb to higher ground and survey the broader landscape. The valley had provided sanctuary during her initial adaptation, but the approaching birth demanded more than solitary wilderness survival. She needed to locate signs of human settlement or travel routes where assistance might be found. After a breakfast of dried fish and the last of the wild raspberries, Eleanor secured her modest camp. The journal and William's portrait went into a pouch fashioned from her shawl and tied around her waist. A water-filled canteen hung from one shoulder, balanced by a small bag of provisions on the opposite side. The walking stick, now notched with counting marks and improved with a smoothed hand grip, provided essential support for the uphill journey. She selected a path toward the eastern ridge, where the slope appeared most gradual. The climb would be challenging in her condition, but the potential information gained justified the effort. Breathing deeply to center herself, Eleanor began the ascent, moving with the measured pace her body had learned through necessity. The lower slope presented little difficulty, grass giving way to scattered pines that provided convenient resting spots in their shade. By mid-morning, she had reached a rocky outcropping that offered the first expanded view of the valley. From this vantage point, Eleanor could trace the river's path for several miles in both directions. Upstream, it wound, through increasingly rugged terrain toward distant mountains. Downstream, it eventually disappeared into dense forest that stretched toward the horizon. She paused to record these observations in her journal, making a crude map that might prove useful if further travel became necessary. The child shifted. Within her, seemingly protesting the exertion, Eleanor rested one hand on her swollen abdomen. "Just a little further," she murmured. "We need to see what lies beyond." Continuing upward, the terrain grew more challenging. Loose stones created treacherous footing, while the increasing steepness made each step an exercise in careful balance. Eleanor found herself stopping more frequently, her breath coming in labored gasps despite her improved physical condition. The pregnancy taxed her strength in ways that grew more pronounced each day. By noon, she had reached a significant promontory, a flat-topped rock formation that jutted from the ridgeline like the prow of a ship. Eleanor carefully navigated the final approach and emerged onto a natural platform, offering a commanding view in all directions. The panorama momentarily stole her breath. Mountains dominated the northern horizon, their peaks still showing traces of snow despite the summer heat. To the east and south, forest and meadowland created a patchwork stretching toward distant haze. The western view revealed the continuing valley with its central river now appearing as a silver thread from this elevation. Eleanor scanned the vast landscape methodically, seeking any sign of human presence. Smoke from settlements, the linear scars of roads or trails, cultivation patterns that would indicate farms. The wilderness seemed uninterrupted in most directions, but as her gaze moved along the northern forest edge, she detected something promising, what appeared to be a thin column of smoke rising several miles distant. Excitement surged through her, immediately tempered by caution. Smoke meant fire, which typically indicated human presence, but whether friend or foe remained unknown. The Harlow gang could be camped in that direction, or it might be indigenous peoples of unknown disposition toward a solitary white woman. It could also represent salvation in the form of settlers or trappers who might help her. Eleanor sat on a sun-warmed rock, opened her journal, and recorded the sighting with its approximate location relative to her camp. The climb had taxed her strength considerably, and attempting to reach the source of smoke today would be foolhardy. A more measured approach was required, returning to her shelter, gathering supplies for a potential journey, and determining the safest route toward the smoke source. As she closed the journal, a sound from the slope below froze her mid-movement, the unmistakable clatter of dislodged stones that signaled another climber's approach. Eleanor quickly moved behind a larger boulder, making herself as inconspicuous as possible while maintaining a line of sight toward the path she had ascended. Minutes passed in tense silence before a figure emerged onto the promontory. A man, tall, broad-shouldered and bearded, moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to wilderness travel. He carried a long rifle in one hand and wore the practical buckskins of a trapper or mountain man. A brace of rabbit carcasses hung from his belt, suggesting a successful morning hunt. From her concealed position, Eleanor studied him carefully. His face, partially obscured by a brown beard streaked with grey, appeared weathered by years of outdoor living. She estimated his age around 40, though wilderness living often aged men beyond their years. A scar ran from his left temple to cheekbone, puckering the skin slightly beneath his eye. His movements suggested alertness without obvious tension, not actively hunting human prey, but certainly aware of potential dangers. This was no Harlow gang member. The solitary approach and focused demeanor didn't match their predatory group behavior, nor did he appear to be indigenous, though his clothing incorporated elements of native design alongside settler practicality. Most likely a trapper or hunter who knew this territory well, perhaps even the source of the smoke she had observed. Eleanor remained motionless, weighing her options. Revealing herself carried obvious risks. Even well-intentioned men could pose dangers to a woman alone in the wilderness. Yet the approaching childbirth made her increasingly desperate for human assistance. This might be her best opportunity to find help before the baby arrived. The decision was abruptly taken from her when the man stopped suddenly, his posture shifting to immediate alertness. His gaze moved directly toward her hiding place, head slightly tilted like a predator catching an unexpected scent. "I know you're there," he called, his voice rough from disuse but not threatening. "Behind the rock. Come out slow with your hands visible." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. The rifle in his hands now pointed in her general direction, though not directly at her position. She considered remaining hidden, but his confident manner suggested he would investigate regardless. "I'm coming out," she called, her own voice sounding strange after weeks of speaking only to herself. "I'm unarmed except for a knife, and I mean no harm." Using her walking stick for support, Eleanor carefully emerged from behind the boulder. The man's eyes widened visibly as he registered her gender and pregnant condition. The rifle barrel immediately lowered toward the ground, though he maintained a ready grip. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a slight nod, surprise evident in his tone.
"You're about the last thing I expected to find up here."
Eleanor steadied herself against the walking stick, maintaining a cautious distance. "I could say the same about you, sir. I've been alone in this valley for over 3 weeks. His brow furrowed as he studied her more carefully, taking in her improvised clothing, weathered appearance, and unmistakable pregnancy. 3 weeks? Alone? He glanced around as if expecting others to emerge. "Where's your people? Husband?" The blunt questions reopened barely healed wounds, but Eleanor maintained her composure. "The Miller Donovan wagon train was attacked by bandits 24 days ago, near Cooper's Creek. I escaped by hiding in a ravine. Everyone else was killed, including my husband." The man's expression darkened, fingers tightening around his rifle. "Harlow's gang," he stated rather than asked. When Eleanor nodded confirmation, his jaw set in a hard line. "They've been working these territories for months. Army can't catch them or won't try hard enough." Something in his tone suggested personal knowledge rather than general awareness of frontier dangers. Eleanor studied him more carefully, noting the intensity that had replaced his initial surprise. "My name is Eleanor Reed," she offered, testing this tentative connection. "My husband was William Reed. We were traveling from Pennsylvania to Oregon Territory." The man hesitated before responding, as if unaccustomed to standard social exchanges. "Caleb Blackwood," he finally replied. "I trap these mountains." Another pause. "You've been surviving alone, in your condition?" "I've managed," Eleanor said, simply unwilling to reveal the depths of her vulnerability to a stranger, regardless of initial impressions. "I have a camp down by the river. I came up here hoping to spot settlements or travelers." Blackwood's gaze moved to her swollen abdomen, then back to her face. His expression remained difficult to read beneath the beard, but something like reluctant admiration flickered in his eyes. "Nearest settlement's Fort Laramie, 60 miles east," he said. "Too far for you to travel alone, especially now." He glanced at the sky, assessing the sun's position. "My cabin's about 4 miles north. Not much, but it's a solid shelter." The invitation, delivered with awkward gruffness, hung in the air between them. Eleanor weighed her limited options against the unknown quantity of this solitary trapper. His knowledge of the Harlow gang troubled her. Was it merely the awareness any frontier dweller would have of regional dangers, or something more personal? "Why? Would you help me?" she asked directly, needing to understand his motivation. Blackwood's expression tightened momentarily before he answered. "Leaving a woman in your condition to face wilderness birth alone would sit poorly with whatever conscience I've got left." He shifted uncomfortably. "Lost my wife and unborn child 6 years back. No help around when complications came. Wouldn't wish that fate on anyone." The admission, clearly difficult for him, carried the weight of genuine pain. Eleanor's instincts, sharpened by weeks of survival decisions, suggested he spoke the truth. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood," she said, "but I need to return to my camp for my possessions. What little I have saved from the massacre has significant value to me." He nodded, understanding. "We can stop at your camp on the way. Be good to reach my cabin before dark." He paused, then added, "If you're coming, your choice, Mrs. Reed." Eleanor appreciated his acknowledgement of her agency, rare among men of her acquaintance even before the massacre. That small respect, combined with her increasingly desperate circumstances, solidified her decision. "I'll accept your help," she said, extending her hand in formal agreement, "and I'm grateful for it." Blackwood seemed momentarily surprised by the gesture, but shook her hand briefly. His calloused palm dwarfed hers, though her own hands had toughened considerably during her weeks of survival. The descent proved more challenging than anticipated. Eleanor's earlier climb had depleted her strength, and the downward trajectory placed different demands on her balance. Blackwood walked slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out safer footholds or offering a steadying hand at particularly difficult passages. He moved with the easy competence of someone who navigated such terrain daily, modifying his pace to accommodate her limitations without comment. By mid-afternoon, they reached Eleanor's riverbank camp. Blackwood surveyed her shelter and improvised tools with silent assessment, his expression revealing neither criticism nor admiration. Eleanor gathered her few possessions quickly: the journal, William's portrait, the cooking pot, and the modest store of preserved food she had accumulated. "Resourceful work," Blackwood finally commented, examining the fish-drying rack she had constructed. "Most city folk wouldn't manage half so well." "Necessity proves a thorough teacher," Eleanor replied, securing her belongings in the makeshift carrying pouch. She cast a final glance at the shelter that had protected her through crucial weeks of adaptation. "I'm ready." The journey to Blackwood's cabin followed game trails that wound through increasing elevation. The route proved less difficult than Eleanor had feared, suggesting Blackwood had chosen paths specifically to accommodate her condition. He maintained a measured pace, stopping at regular intervals to allow her rest without her needing to request. Their conversation remained minimal during the journey. Blackwood occasionally pointed out landmarks or mentioned water sources, but volunteered no personal information beyond his earlier revelation about his wife. Eleanor, conserving strength for walking, asked a few questions despite her curiosity about this solitary man who had unexpectedly appeared in her desperate circumstances. As the afternoon waned toward evening, they crested a final ridge to reveal a small clearing nestled against a rocky hillside. A log cabin stood at its center, smoke rising from a stone chimney. Nearby, a smaller structure that appeared to be a storage shed or smokehouse completed the modest homestead. A spring-fed stream cut across one edge of the clearing, while tall pines provided both windbreak and concealment from casual observation. "It's not much," Blackwood acknowledged as they approached, "but it's solid and dry." The cabin proved more substantial than its exterior suggested. Built of thick pine logs, carefully notched and sealed with mixed mud and moss, it featured a single room, approximately 15 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, currently hosting a small cooking fire. A narrow bed, covered with furs, occupied the corner furthest from the door. A table and 2 chairs stood near the cabin's only window, while shelves along the walls held supplies, traps, and other equipment of the trapper's trade. Eleanor entered cautiously, instinctively, cataloguing details as she had learned to do in unfamiliar territory. The interior was meticulously organized, every item having its designated place. Despite the nature of Blackwood's profession, the cabin showed no trophies or decorative displays of animal remains beyond the functional furs. The space smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the faint notes of herbs hanging in bundles from ceiling beams. "You'll take the bed," Blackwood stated, setting his rifle in a rack by the door. "I'll use my summer bedroll." Eleanor started to protest, but recognized the futility of arguing with frontier hospitality, especially in her condition. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Your kindness is appreciated." He acknowledged this with a nod, then moved to the fireplace where a pot simmered. "Stew's been cooking slow, nothing fancy, but it's filling." The meal proved simple but nourishing. Venison stew with wild onions and roots, Eleanor recognized as similar to those she had gathered during her weeks alone. They ate mostly in silence, the ritual of shared food creating its own tentative connection between two people accustomed to solitude. As dusk deepened outside the cabin's single window, Blackwood lit a tallow candle and placed it on the table. The gentle illumination softened the rugged interior, creating an almost domestic atmosphere that highlighted the strangeness of their situation. Two strangers bound together by wilderness circumstance and unspoken tragedies. "How long have you lived here?" Eleanor asked, breaking the extended silence. Blackwood considered before answering. 5 years in this cabin, been in these mountains, near 15 altogether. Alone all that time. His expression tightened momentarily. After Caroline died, yes, mostly alone. The mention of his wife opened a door that Eleanor felt reluctant to push further, yet needed to understand. "You mentioned the Harlow gang earlier. You seem to know of them specifically." Blackwood's hands stilled in the process of cleaning his plate. His gaze, when it met hers, carried a coldness she hadn't seen previously. "I know them," he confirmed, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Frank Harlow and his murderers. Been tracking them between trapping seasons for the past 2 years." The admission hung in the air between them. Eleanor processed its implications slowly, understanding dawning about this solitary man's purpose beyond simple survival. "You're hunting them," she stated rather than asked. "They raided a settlement near Fort Bridger. Small place, barely a dozen. Families." His voice remained level, but tension radiated from his rigid posture. "Caroline was visiting her sister there when they came. 18 people were killed, among them my wife and unborn child." Eleanor absorbed this revelation, pieces falling into place about the man who had unexpectedly become her protector. "You're seeking vengeance, justice," Blackwood corrected firmly. "The army gave up the chase after a few weeks. Marshal from Fort Laramie said they likely fled to Montana Territory, beyond his jurisdiction." His gaze fixed on the middle distance, seeing something beyond the cabin walls. "So I track them when I can, learn their movements. Someday they'll make a mistake." The quiet determination in his voice carried no bravado, only the patient certainty of a man who had transformed grief into purpose. Eleanor recognized the dangerous edge beneath his controlled exterior, not threatening to her, but certainly to those who had created his personal mission. "And now they've attacked another wagon train," she said softly. "Created another survivor." Blackwood's focus returned to her, his expression shifting from cold detachment to something more complex. "You witnessed them," he stated. "Could identify them." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the value this information represented to his long-standing pursuit. "I saw several clearly enough. Their leader is most distinctly tall, with a scar across his chin." She touched her own chin to indicate the location, called himself Harlow when giving orders. Something shifted in Blackwood's demeanor, a subtle intensification, like a predator catching a fresh scent. "Frank Harlow," he confirmed, "former Army captain, discharged for brutality. Would you testify if they were captured? Identify them to a marshal or judge?" "Without hesitation," Eleanor replied, her voice strengthening with conviction. "They murdered my husband and everyone I traveled with, left me alone to birth a child in the wilderness." Her hand moved protectively across her abdomen. "I would see them hang for what they've done." The statement hung between them, creating an unexpected alliance born of shared loss and purpose. Blackwood studied her with new assessment, as if truly seeing beyond her pregnancy and vulnerability to the determination beneath. "Rest now," he finally said, rising to clear the table. "Morning comes early here. We can talk more then about what happens next." Eleanor made her way to the offered bed, the most comfortable surface she had experienced since the massacre. As she settled beneath the fur coverings, she observed Blackwood moving with efficient purpose around the cabin, securing the door, checking supplies, preparing his bedroll near the fireplace. His movements held the unconscious rhythm of a long-established routine, yet his presence remained hyper-aware of her as a new element in his carefully ordered existence. Outside, a distant wolf's howl echoed through the gathering darkness. Eleanor found herself wondering if it might be the she-wolf who had shared her first desperate night of survival. Blackwood paused in his activities, head tilted slightly toward the sound in a gesture that reminded her of her own growing attunement to wilderness voices. "Hunting pack," he commented, catching her attentive gaze, "moving along the eastern ridge." "I shared a den with a mother wolf and her pups," Eleanor found herself saying. "The first night after the massacre, she could have killed me but didn't." Surprise flickered across Blackwood's weathered features. "Wolves generally avoid humans unless desperate." He considered her with renewed interest. "You've had an unusual introduction to mountain life, Mrs. Reed." "Eleanor," she offered, the formality suddenly seeming absurd given their circumstances. "If we're to share this cabin while awaiting my child's birth, perhaps we should use given names." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Eleanor, then." Another Pause. Most call me Blackwood, but Caleb is fine. This small exchange, simple under normal conditions, represented a significant shift in their tentative connection. No longer merely trapper and survivor, they had acknowledged the unusual intimacy their situation demanded. Two strangers bound by parallel tragedies, now sharing shelter and purpose in the wilderness that had claimed so much from each of them. As the candle burned low, casting flickering shadows across log walls, Eleanor closed her eyes. For the first time in 24 days, she would sleep with a solid roof above her and another human presence nearby. The circumstances remained far from ideal, but compared to her desperate campsite by the river, this rough cabin represented an unexpected reprieve, a chance to gather strength before facing the challenges still to come. Tomorrow would bring necessary conversations about her advancing pregnancy, about Blackwood's vengeful quest, about whether their paths had intersected purely by chance or through some design beyond their understanding. But for tonight, the simple security of shelter and companionship provided sufficient blessing. Eleanor drifted towards sleep, one hand resting protectively on her swollen abdomen, where the child shifted gently, as if also settling into this unexpected sanctuary. Outside, the wolf called once more into the mountain night, its voice echoing across the wilderness that had nearly claimed them. All dawn broke with golden light filtering through the cabin's single window, rousing Eleanor from the deepest sleep she had experienced since the massacre. For a moment, the unfamiliar surroundings disoriented her before memory returned. The climb, the encounter with Caleb Blackwood, the unlikely sanctuary of a trapper's cabin. Blackwood himself was already absent, though evidence of his morning activities remained. Fresh water in a bucket by the wash basin, kindling added to the banked fire, a pot of something aromatic simmering at the hearth's edge. Eleanor rose carefully, her body stiff from the previous day's exertion, despite the relative comfort of a proper bed. The door opened as she was washing her face, Blackwood entering with an armload of split firewood. He acknowledged her with a nod, seeming unsurprised to find her awake. "Coffee's brewing," he said, stacking the wood neatly beside the fireplace. "And there's porridge. Not fancy, but it'll hold you." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, still adjusting to human conversation after weeks of solitude. "I'm not accustomed to being served breakfast." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Don't get used to it. Just figured you needed rest after yesterday's trek." They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, each still navigating the awkwardness of unexpected cohabitation. Eleanor studied Blackwood covertly as they ate. In daylight, she could better assess the man whose cabin now sheltered her. His appearance confirmed her initial impressions, weathered by elements and hardship, but carrying himself with the natural authority of someone completely self-reliant. When they had finished eating, Blackwood cleared the wooden bowls with efficient movements, then settled at the table across from her, his expression growing serious. "Need to discuss what happens next," he began, voice matter-of-fact. "Your child's coming soon. Can't say exactly when, without knowing more than I'd presume to ask, but guessing within weeks, not months." Eleanor appreciated his directness. "By my calculation, approximately 6 weeks remain before the expected time, though first babies often arrive late, according to those with experience." Blackwood nodded. "Still, preparations need making and decisions." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Fort Laramie has a doctor, army surgeon mostly, but he attends to settlers when needed. Getting there means 60 miles of rough country, some of it Sioux hunting territory. Is that what you're suggesting, that we attempt to reach Fort Laramie before the birth?" "It's an option." His gaze was assessing but not pressuring. "Alternative is preparing for birth here. I've basic medical supplies and some knowledge from helping at carvings, but I'm no midwife or doctor." Eleanor considered carefully. The journey would be arduous in her condition, with significant risks along the way. Remaining meant facing childbirth with minimal assistance, but avoided travel dangers. Neither option promised safety, only different vulnerabilities. "There's a third consideration," she said finally. "The Harlow gang. You've been tracking them for years without success. Now I've appeared, someone who witnessed their latest attack and can identify them to authorities." Blackwood's expression shifted subtly, a predatory focus entering his gaze. "Been thinking on that too. Information you carry could help bring them to justice. Question is how best to use it. You believe they're still in the region?" Last reports had them moving north after hitting wagon trains. They typically winter in Montana Territory, where law's thinner, then work south when the travel season brings fresh targets. His finger traced an invisible map on the tabletop. "Army patrol from Fort Laramie spotted sign of them near Medicine Bow 2 weeks back. If patterns hold, they're working the emigrant trail for late-season travelers." The tactical assessment revealed another dimension to this solitary trapper, a methodical tracker who had studied his prey with deadly seriousness. Eleanor recognized both the danger and opportunity his vendetta represented. "If we travel to Fort Laramie," she suggested. "Carefully, I could give testimony to authorities there. Perhaps prompt a proper manhunt with my account of the massacre." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Armies already failed to catch them multiple times. Bureaucracy and territorial boundaries hamper them. Marshals are few, with too much ground to cover." His fist tightened on the table. "Our courts need witnesses and evidence, while Harlow needs only bullets and anonymity." The bitterness in his voice revealed the frustration of his long, unsuccessful pursuit. Eleanor understood his skepticism about official justice, yet couldn't embrace vigilantism without reservation. "What alternative do you suggest?" she asked. Blackwood considered her question, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "Been developing contacts among friendly Shoshone bands. They track Harlow too. His gang raided 2 of their hunting camps last season. Between their information and mine, I've been narrowing Harlow's likely routes." His gaze fixed on hers, with unexpected intensity. "Your testimony at Fort Laramie might flush them into movement. With proper preparation, we could use that." "We?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "My condition hardly makes me suitable for hunting outlaws." "Your condition makes you valuable bait," Blackwood stated bluntly, then immediately raised a hand when her expression hardened. "Not as you're thinking. Your testimony would become known. Word would spread that a surviving witness could identify them. Harlow's too cunning to ignore such a threat." Eleanor understood the dangerous logic. "You believe they would come looking for me, eventually, and we'd be ready." Seeing her continued wariness, he added, "Not suggesting putting you in danger. Suggesting using the threat you represent to make them move predictably. The plan held both brilliance and significant risk." Eleanor considered it while absently rubbing her swollen abdomen, the child within shifting as if registering her tension. 6 weeks, she said finally. "That's my first priority, bringing this child safely into the world. Justice for William and the others matters deeply, but not at the expense of our baby's safety." Blackwood nodded, accepting this boundary. Without argument, fair position, timing might work in our favor regardless. Journey to Fort Laramie takes at least a week in good conditions. By then, you'd be within a month of term. Challenging for travel, but potentially still manageable with proper preparation. "And if we make this journey, what exactly would you have me do at Fort Laramie?" "Give detailed testimony about the attack. Describe Harlow and as many gang members as you can recall. Request official protection as a material witness." His expression grew grimmer. "Then return here with me, while the information spreads naturally through official channels." Return here? Eleanor hadn't anticipated this element. Why not remain at the fort where protection would be available? because predictability makes you vulnerable. Harlow has contacts around settlements, learns who comes and goes. But up here, he gestured toward the surrounding wilderness. My territory. I know every approach, every vantage point, and they'd never expect a witness to leave fort protection. The strategy reflected years of hunter's logic, using knowledge of territory and prey behavior to gain advantage. Eleanor recognized the effectiveness while remaining troubled by the calculated nature of using her testimony as deliberate provocation. I need time to consider all aspects, she said finally. Meanwhile, preparations for the birth take precedence. Blackwood accepted this with a nod. Reasonable. We have immediate concerns regardless of future decisions. He rose from the table. First being proper supplies for your needs. I'll make a trip to Jefferson's trading post tomorrow. 2 days' journey. Round trip if I push hard. Jefferson's? Small outpost run by an old mountain man and his crow wife, closer than Fort Laramie, and carries basic goods. Can get proper food, cloth for baby things, maybe even a letter sent towards civilization if you've family to notify. The consideration surprised Eleanor. During her weeks of wilderness survival, such practical matters had seemed impossibly distant. Now Blackwood's matter-of-fact approach reopened connections to the wider world she had temporarily lost. I have an older sister in Philadelphia, she said. She should know what's happened, though I can't imagine the letter reaching her before. The child arrives. Still, family should know you've survived. Blackwood reached for his coat. Make a list of what you need while I check traps. Think practical. Jefferson's isn't a city store, but Eliza keeps decent supplies for women's needs. After he departed, Eleanor explored the cabin more thoroughly. Despite its utilitarian simplicity, the space revealed much about its solitary inhabitant. Blackwood maintained meticulous organization, tools hung in specific places, supplies stored in labeled containers, everything arranged for maximum efficiency. A small bookshelf held unexpected titles, not just practical guides to trapping and wilderness survival, but several classics of literature, a Bible well worn at certain passages, and a book of poetry by Wordsworth. Most revealing was a small pine box kept on a high shelf. Eleanor's cleaning efforts brought her to it, and though she respected his privacy enough not to open it, the box's position and careful craftsmanship suggested it contained significant mementos, likely related to his deceased wife. Throughout the day, Eleanor busied herself with improving her temporary home. She swept the packed earth floor, organized her few possessions, and began preparing a more substantial evening meal from Blackwood's stores. The domestic activities felt simultaneously foreign after weeks of survival-focused existence and comfortingly familiar from her previous life. Blackwood returned late afternoon with several rabbits and a string of trout. He paused noticeably at the cabin entrance, taking in the changes with an unreadable expression. "Hope you don't mind," Eleanor said, suddenly conscious that she had rearranged another person's space without permission. "Keeping busy helps me. And think." "Don't mind," he replied after a moment. "Been a while since the place looked properly kept." He handed her the cleaned fish. "Found wild onions growing near the creek bed. They're in the pouch." The simple contribution to her cooking efforts represented a small but significant adjustment to shared living. As she prepared their meal, Blackwood worked at the table, making a list of his own for the trading post journey. Their evening conversation centered on practical planning, items needed for the birth, contingencies for various complications, preparations that would serve them regardless of whether they ultimately traveled to Fort Laramie. Blackwood's knowledge of childbirth, while limited to livestock and second-hand accounts, demonstrated thorough consideration of potential challenges. Eliza. Jefferson might have more useful advice, he noted. She's midwifed for both settler women and her own people. "You'd consider bringing her here?" Eleanor asked, surprised by the suggestion. "If necessary, she's trustworthy and skilled." His expression grew distant. Might have saved Caroline if distance hadn't prevented it. The rare mention of his wife hung in the air between them. Eleanor recognized an opening to better understand the man whose protection she had accepted. "How long were you and Caroline married?" she asked carefully. Blackwood was silent long enough that Eleanor thought he might ignore the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flatness of deliberately contained emotion. 4 years. Met her when I brought furs to her father's store in St. Louis. She was different, wanted to know about mountain life beyond the romantic notions ladies typically have. A ghost of a smile touched his lips briefly. Shocked everyone by marrying a rough trapper with no prospects but wilderness living. She came here with you. Not immediately. I built a proper cabin first, near a small settlement that's gone now. We had 2 good years there before sickness took most families away. His hands worked automatically at cleaning his pipe as he spoke. Caroline was visiting her sister at Fort Bridger when Harlow's raid happened. I was 5 days hard ride away, working trap lines. By the time word reached me, he left the sentence unfinished, its conclusion evident. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said simply. Blackwood nodded acknowledgement, then deliberately changed the subject. "Made a list for Jefferson's. You should add anything specific you need." The conversation shifted back to practical matters, but the brief glimpse into Blackwood's past altered Eleanor's perception of him. His gruff exterior and solitary habits made more sense in light of the tragedy that had reshaped his existence, just as the wagon train massacre had irrevocably changed hers. Before retiring that night, Eleanor added to her journal entry, recording not just facts, but her evolving impressions of her unlikely protector. "Caleb Blackwood presents contradictions I'm still deciphering. A solitary man who offered shelter without hesitation. A hunter consumed by vengeance, who nonetheless shows consideration for my condition. A frontier survivor whose cabin contains poetry. Our parallel losses have created an unusual alliance. Whether it extends beyond my immediate needs remains to be seen, but I find myself grateful for his competence in this wilderness that nearly claimed me." Morning brought steady rain, water streaming from the cabin's eaves in silver curtains. Blackwood studied the weather with a trapper's experienced eye. "Storms settling in for the day," he observed. "Trail to Jefferson's would be treacherous. Better to wait until it passes." The delay created an unexpected day of shared confinement. After initial awkwardness, they established a rhythm of separate activities that occasionally intersected. Blackwood repaired traps at the table, while Eleanor used scraps of cloth he provided to begin fashioning rudimentary baby garments. The steady drumming of rain created a cocoon of isolation around the cabin, temporarily suspending larger concerns beyond their immediate shelter. By afternoon, Eleanor's sewing had progressed substantially, producing several simple swaddling clothes and a small cap. Blackwood, finished with his trap work, had moved to whittling a piece of pine with his hunting knife. His large hands managed the delicate work with surprising dexterity. "May I ask what you're making?" Eleanor inquired after watching his focused concentration. He hesitated, then turned the piece to show a partially formed carving of a rabbit. Thought the little one might need something to hold on to eventually. The gruff explanation carried unexpected gentleness. "My father carved animals for us as children. Remember how they helped on difficult days." The thoughtfulness behind the gesture touched Eleanor deeply. This small act of preparation for her child's future revealed dimensions to Blackwood beyond the vengeful tracker or pragmatic survivalist. "It's beautifully done," she said sincerely. "The baby will treasure it." Blackwood returned to his carving, though a slight color at his neck suggested the compliment had affected him. Their companionable silence resumed, punctuated only by the persistent rain and occasional crackle from the fireplace. That evening, after a simple meal of venison stew from Blackwood's stores, Eleanor's condition prompted an unexpected development. A sharp pain lanced through her lower back, causing her to gasp and brace against the table. Blackwood was immediately alert. "What is it?" "Just discomfort," Eleanor assured him, as the sensation subsided. "The baby's position sometimes puts pressure on my spine. Nothing concerning at this stage." His expression remained doubtful. "You're certain it's not early labor?" "Reasonably certain. I've been having occasional twinges for weeks." She straightened carefully. "Though I appreciate your concern." Minutes passed before the movement repeated. Definitely human, definitely attempting concealment. A man's figure briefly visible among the trees, then gone again. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Blackwood wasn't due back until evening at earliest. The Shoshone he had mentioned would approach openly. This furtive behavior suggested threat rather than friendly visitation. Options limited by her condition and isolation, Eleanor chose the most defensible position, inside the cabin with barred door and loaded rifle. The structure's solid log construction offered better protection than flight into unfamiliar forest while heavily pregnant. Another glimpse of movement, this time from a different position along the tree line. Two individuals, at minimum, coordinating their approach. Eleanor steadied her breathing, focusing on practical responses rather than rising fear. The rifle's familiarity helped center her thoughts. William's patient instructions during their journey west, returning with surprising clarity. "When it comes to troublemakers," he had said, "sometimes just showing you're armed is enough to change their thinking." Following this logic, Eleanor moved to the doorway, rifle visible but not directly aimed, and called out firmly, "I can see you at the forest edge. This property is occupied and defended. State your business openly or move." On. Silence followed her challenge, then low voices conferring beyond her hearing. Finally, a man stepped partially into view, keeping tactical distance and partial tree cover. "Just passing travelers, ma'am," he called, his tone deliberately casual. "Looking for directions to the main trail. Didn't mean to startle you." Something in his voice, the carefully constructed harmlessness perhaps, or the underlying note of assessment, raised Eleanor's suspicions further. Legitimate travelers in this remote area would approach clearly and directly, not skulk at forest edges. "The main trail is 2 ridges east," she replied, maintaining a neutral tone while scanning for his companions. "You're well off course. Best head back the way you came." The man took another step forward, revealing more of his appearance. Trail-worn clothing typical of frontier travelers, but with a quality to his boots and gun belt that suggested better resources than average hunters. His face remained partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Mighty strange, finding a woman alone up here," he observed, ignoring her directions. "Your man nearby?" The question confirmed ill intent. Eleanor adjusted her grip on the rifle, making the movement visible. "Near enough. Expected back with our Shoshone hunting partners." The strategic embellishment gave the man pause. His head turned slightly, signaling to someone Eleanor couldn't see. The momentary shift revealed what he had kept carefully shadowed, a distinctive scar running across his chin. Recognition flashed through Eleanor like lightning. Frank Harlow, the leader of the gang that had massacred the wagon train, the man who had ordered William's death. Standing less than 50 yards from her, assessing the cabin with calculating eyes, shock nearly betrayed her. Only the protective instinct toward her unborn child kept Eleanor's composure intact. She maintained her position, rifle steady, expression carefully neutral, while her mind raced through implications. Somehow, impossibly, the very predators Blackwood had hunted for years had found their way to his doorstep, on precisely the day of his absence. "Your Shoshone friends," Harlow said smoothly, "they hunting on the North Ridge? Passed some natives up that way yesterday." The question contained a probe, testing her claim, seeking information about potential witnesses or defenders. Eleanor recognized the tactical nature of the exchange, understanding that her responses might determine whether they rushed the cabin immediately or retreated to plan a more calculated attack. "They range widely," she replied vaguely. "My husband doesn't share their precise routes with me." Harlow nodded thoughtfully, gaze moving between Eleanor and the cabin's construction, assessing defensibility. "Well, we won't trouble you further." Much obliged for the directions, he retreated into the tree line with a casual wave that belied the predatory assessment in his eyes. Eleanor maintained her position until certain they had withdrawn beyond immediate sight, then quickly barred the door and moved to secure the cabin's single window. Her hands trembled as the full import of the encounter registered. Blackwood's worst enemies, the murderers they had discussed confronting through calculated strategy, had appeared without warning at the moment of her greatest vulnerability. The timing suggested terrible possibilities. Either they had somehow tracked her specifically, or Blackwood's activities had drawn their attention to this area through some misfortune of crossed paths. Eleanor checked the rifle again, positioned, water and food within easy reach of defensible positions, and considered her options. Blackwood wouldn't return until evening at earliest. Harlow and his men, at least two, possibly more, were unlikely to simply move on after discovering a lone woman in a remote cabin. The situation presented a deadly equation with few favorable outcomes. The midday hours passed in tense vigilance. Eleanor maintained a watch through gaps in the window covering, detecting occasional movement that confirmed her fears. The Harlow gang hadn't departed, but had established observation positions around the clearing. They were waiting for something, perhaps nightfall, perhaps Blackwood's return, perhaps simply gathering information before making their move. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor had formulated the outline of a desperate plan. Direct confrontation offered. Little hope against multiple armed opponents. Flight through unfamiliar forest, while heavily pregnant, seemed equally hopeless. But Blackwood's detailed knowledge of the surrounding terrain, shared during their evening conversations, suggested a third possibility. During his years of hunting the Harlow gang, Blackwood had developed countless contingencies for dealing with threats to his cabin. Among these was an escape route, a narrow ravine behind the cabin that led to a cave system he had partially mapped. He had mentioned it casually during their discussions of emergency preparations for the birth. "If trouble ever comes from the main trail," he had explained, "the South Ravine offers cover all the way to the limestone caves. Good shelter, hidden entrance, defensible position. The route would be challenging in her condition, but not impossible. More importantly, if she could reach the caves undetected, they offered security until Blackwood's return. The immediate difficulty lay in leaving the cabin without being spotted by Harlow's watchful eyes. Fortune provided an unexpected ally as afternoon waned. Dark clouds gathered over the western mountains, and by 4 o'clock a summer thunderstorm rolled across the valley. Heavy rain reduced visibility and masked sound, perfect conditions for attempted escape. Eleanor packed quickly and efficiently. Food, water, the rifle and ammunition, minimal essential supplies for potential childbirth, her journal, and William's portrait. Everything fit into a canvas sack that Blackwood used for carrying trap supplies. The weight would be significant but manageable for the relatively short distance to the caves. As thunder crashed overhead and rain hammered against the cabin roof, Eleanor slipped through the rear door that faced away from the main clearing. The initial dash to the tree line left her exposed for perhaps 15 seconds, an eternity that passed without alarm or pursuit. Once within the forest's edge, she oriented herself toward the narrow ravine Blackwood had described, moving as quickly as her condition allowed through the downpour. The southern ravine appeared as promised, a deep cut in the hillside partially. Obscured by dense undergrowth, Eleanor descended carefully, using exposed tree roots as handholds on the slippery slope. The rain provided cover, but also increased the difficulty and danger of the route, transforming the ravine floor into a shallow stream bed of flowing runoff. 20 minutes of cautious progress brought her to the limestone formations Blackwood had described. The cave entrance, nearly invisible behind a fallen pine and curtain of vines, offered welcome shelter from the storm. Eleanor squeezed through the narrow opening, finding herself in a surprisingly spacious chamber with a high ceiling and dry floor. Blackwood had clearly used this location before. A small circle of stones indicated a fire pit, while a stack of firewood covered in oilcloth waited against one wall. Minimal supplies, a pot, some tools, a folded blanket, suggested he maintained it as an emergency shelter. Eleanor offered silent thanks for his meticulous preparation as she settled into this unexpected sanctuary. Outside, the storm continued unabated, masking any sounds of pursuit or discovery. Eleanor positioned herself where she could observe the cave entrance while remaining concealed from outside view. The rifle lay across her lap, loaded and ready, though she prayed its use wouldn't become necessary. As daylight faded into stormy dusk, tension and physical exertion took their toll. Despite her determination to maintain vigilance, exhaustion pulled Eleanor toward uneasy sleep, interrupted by the occasional sharp kick from the increasingly active child within. She woke with a start to absolute darkness and the sensation of another presence in the cave. Heart hammering, she reached for the rifle only to find it gently but firmly held in place. A hand covered her mouth before she could cry out. "It's me," Blackwood's voice whispered close to her ear. "Stay silent." Relief flooded through her as he removed his hand. Even in darkness, she could sense his tension, the coiled readiness of a predator in hostile territory. "Harlow," she breathed, barely audible. "At the cabin." "I know." His voice remained low, controlled despite the gravity of the confirmation. "They found the cabin empty. Looking for you now, but the rain washed out any trail. We're secure here for the moment." Eleanor's eyes had adjusted enough to make out his silhouette as he moved to retrieve something from his pack. A moment later, the faintest glow of a shielded lantern illuminated the cave just enough for basic visibility, without betraying their position to outside observers. Blackwood looked trail-worn and alert, his usual stoic expression intensified by the circumstance. "You handled it right," he said, genuine approval in his tone. "Getting here undetected was the best possible move." "How did you know?" Eleanor asked. "You weren't due back until nightfall." "Spotted their sign near the Western Creek crossing. Now fresh tracks moving toward the cabin. Pushed hard to get back ahead of them, but they'd already arrived." His expression darkened. "Watched from cover as they surrounded the place. Counted 5 men, including Harlow himself." "I saw him," Eleanor confirmed, voice strengthening with contained anger. "Recognized the scar immediately. He pretended to be a lost traveler seeking directions." Blackwood's focus sharpened. "You spoke with him directly, and he didn't recognize you from the wagon train?" "I stayed in the doorway, partly shadowed. It's been over a month, and he only glimpsed me briefly during the attack." She rubbed her arms, suddenly chilled despite the cave's relative warmth. "But he was assessing the cabin, looking for vulnerabilities. They didn't leave as they claimed. No, they set up watch positions. Standard practice before hitting an isolated homestead." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "When the storm hit, I used the cover to check if you were still inside. Found it empty. Hoped you'd remembered our conversation about the caves." The exchange confirmed what Eleanor had already suspected. This encounter was no coincidence. "How did they find this place? Your cabin is deliberately isolated, difficult to locate without specific knowledge." Blackwood's expression shifted toward grim understanding. "Jefferson's trading post. Must have stopped there after I left. Eliza would never betray me willingly, but Jefferson might have mentioned my location if threatened." He shook his head. Or they followed my trail back. Either way, they're here now. And we're trapped, Eleanor concluded, hand moving protectively to her belly. Not trapped, Blackwood corrected firmly. They don't know about these caves. I do. There's a secondary exit that leads to higher ground about half a mile from here. Difficult passage, but manageable. The practical information steadied Eleanor, providing direction amid uncertainty. What's your plan? Blackwood considered before answering, weighing factors she could only partially guess. Dawn's about 4 hours away. Storm's passing. They'll expand their search once visibility improves. His gaze met hers directly. 2 options. Try moving you to a safer location using the back passage, or I deal with them directly while you remain hidden. The stark alternatives highlighted their precarious position. Eleanor processed both with the clarity she had developed through survival. Dealing with them directly means 5 against 1. Poor odds, regardless of your skills. Better odds than I've had in years of hunting them, Blackwood countered. They're on my territory now, overconfident, and I know exactly where they are. And if you fail, I face them alone. The brutal reality needed stating. Blackwood nodded, acknowledging the truth without sugarcoating. That's the risk. But moving you through rough terrain in darkness carries its own dangers. Could trigger early labor, injury. He left the remaining concerns unspoken. Eleanor weighed the options against her deepest priorities, her child's safety, justice for William, and the life she hadn't expected to share with this solitary trapper, now inexplicably bound to her. Fate. There's a third alternative, she suggested carefully, one that uses their expectations against them. Blackwood's expression showed interest rather than dismissal. I'm listening. They're hunting a lone, pregnant woman. Vulnerable, frightened, valuable as a witness against them. What if we give them exactly that, but on our terms? Eleanor outlined her emerging strategy, drawing on both Blackwood's tactical knowledge and her own understanding of how men like Harlow perceived women. As she spoke, Blackwood's initial skepticism transformed into thoughtful consideration. The plan carried significant risk, but offered advantages their separate approaches lacked. By morning, they had refined it into something both believed might succeed. A careful orchestration of Harlow's expectations against the reality of their preparation. Dawn broke with lingering clouds and mist rising from the rain-soaked forest. From their vantage point at the cave's hidden secondary entrance, Eleanor and Blackwood observed movement around the cabin. 3 men visible, 2 likely remaining concealed, all showing growing frustration at their quarry's disappearance. They'll expand the search pattern soon, Blackwood predicted, checking his rifle one final time. Follow the ravine first, most likely. Eleanor adjusted the torn and muddied dress they had deliberately prepared to enhance her appearance of desperate flight. The weight of Blackwood's smaller pistol, concealed in the folds of her skirt, felt strange but necessary. Her role in their plan required appearing vulnerable while maintaining capacity for self-defense, if circumstances demanded. "Remember," Blackwood said, his tone carrying more emotion than she had previously heard from him, "your safety and the child's come first. If anything changes, abandon the plan immediately." Eleanor nodded, touched by the concern beneath his tactical focus. "The same applies to you. No unnecessary risks for vengeance alone." Their gazes held briefly, acknowledging the complex bond that had formed through shared danger and purpose. Then Blackwood was gone, moving with silent efficiency into position for his role in their desperate gambit. Eleanor waited the agreed 15 minutes, then began her carefully staged emergence from the forest. She stumbled deliberately toward the clearing, one hand braced against her lower back, the picture of exhaustion and fear. The performance contained enough truth to be convincing. Genuine fatigue from a night in the cave, authentic concern for the dangers they faced. The reaction came swiftly. A shout from the nearest watcher, then 2 men approaching with weapons. Ready, but not directly aimed. Eleanor continued her stumbling progress, seemingly unaware of their presence, until they were 30 yards away. Her startled gasp and protective arm across her abdomen completed the image of a vulnerable woman caught in hopeless flight. She turned as if to flee, then stopped, recognizing the futility. "Please," she called, voice deliberately quavering. "I'm with my child. I mean no harm." The men exchanged glances, then motioned her forward. One called toward the cabin, "Harlow! Found her trying to circle back!" Frank Harlow emerged from the cabin doorway, studying Eleanor with calculating eyes as she was brought before him. Recognition slowly dawned in his expression as he took in her features more carefully than during their previous encounter. "Well, now," he said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "If it isn't our missing witness from the wagon train. Thought we'd been thorough that day, but it seems we missed one." His gaze moved to her pregnancy. Two, actually. Eleanor maintained her facade of fear-tinged defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about. My husband is a trapper. We live here." "Your husband," Harlow repeated skeptically. "The same one you said would be returning with Shoshone friends." Strange how he never appeared. He circled her slowly, assessing. "No. I think you're the woman who escaped our little cleanup at the Miller-Donovan wagons. Resourceful of you, hiding all this time." He stopped directly before her, close enough that Eleanor could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "Question is, have you told anyone what you saw that day? The marshal at Fort Laramie, perhaps?" "I don't know any marshal," Eleanor insisted, her voice cracking with genuine tension beneath the performance. "Please, my baby." Harlow's expression showed no compassion, only tactical calculation. "Your baby is the least of your concerns right now. You're a loose end, and I don't tolerate those." He glanced toward his men. "Get her inside. We'll decide what to do with her after determining exactly what she knows and who else might know it." As they moved toward the cabin, Eleanor counted figures and positions. 4 men were visible, including Harlow. The 5th must be positioned somewhere as lookout, exactly as they had anticipated in their planning. The moment approached for Blackwood's part in their desperate strategy. Inside the cabin, Harlow directed his men to secure doors and windows while he questioned Eleanor. The atmosphere tightened with predatory anticipation. These men had committed multiple massacres, without consequence. One witness, however pregnant, posed no moral obstacle to their practiced brutality. "Now then," Harlow began, seating himself across from Eleanor with false civility, "let's discuss exactly what—" The distinctive crack of a rifle shot interrupted. Him followed immediately by a shout of alarm from outside. The carefully orchestrated diversion had begun, Blackwood eliminating the outlying sentinel with a precision shot that both removed one threat and created necessary confusion. Harlow reacted instantly, barking orders to his remaining men. "Reynolds, check the perimeter. Davis, watch the woman." As the cabin erupted into tactical repositioning, Eleanor implemented her part of the plan. The concealed pistol emerged from her skirts, aimed directly at the man left guarding her. His momentary shock at finding his supposedly helpless prisoner armed gave her the critical advantage. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice transformed from frightened victim to steely determination. "I know how to use this." Outside, another shot cracked through the morning air, followed by a cry of pain. Blackwood was methodically reducing their opponents, creating the illusion of multiple attackers through rapid relocation between prepared positions. Harlow, halfway to the door, turned back at Eleanor's words. His expression darkened as he registered the pistol in her steady hands. "You little—" "Frank Harlow," she interrupted, her voice carrying formal weight beyond the immediate threat. "I witnessed you murder my husband, William Reed, and dozens of innocent travelers. I recognize you by the scar on your chin and your voice giving orders during the massacre." The formal language of testimony, practiced with Blackwood during their planning, struck Harlow like a physical blow. This wasn't merely about immediate survival. She was establishing the legal case against him, speaking words that could send him to the gallows if witnessed. His hand moved toward his holstered pistol. Eldenor's response was immediate, a shot that deliberately struck the wall, inches from his head. "The next one won't miss," she promised, the pistol remaining steady despite her condition. "I had an excellent teacher." The standoff crystallized. In that moment, Harlow calculating odds against this unexpected adversary, Eleanor maintaining both aim and formal recitation of his crimes. Outside, the systematic elimination of his gang continued with precision that suggested a larger attacking force rather than a single determined hunter. The cabin door crashed open, revealing Blackwood with a rifle leveled directly at Harlow. "Don't," he advised coldly, as the outlaw's hand twitched again toward his weapon. Recognition flashed across Harlow's features. "Blackwood!" he spat. "Should have known. Still chasing vengeance for your woman at Fort Bridger?" "Justice." Blackwood corrected, moving to position himself protectively near Eleanor while maintaining his aim. "For Caroline, for the Miller Donovan party, for every innocent you've murdered." The moment stretched with terrible significance. Years of pursuit, multiple massacres, personal tragedies, all converging in this small cabin with its unlikely defenders. Harlow's eyes darted between them, seeking leverage or escape, and finding neither. "The others," Eleanor asked quietly. "Won't be joining us," Blackwood confirmed, his tone revealing nothing about the moral weight of that accomplishment. Harlow's expression shifted subtly. The predator, recognizing his position, had fundamentally changed. "What now, Blackwood? Summary execution doesn't seem like your style." "Fort Laramie has a proper jail," Blackwood replied evenly. "Marshal Gardner will be interested in hearing Mrs. Reed's testimony, alongside my evidence from multiple crime scenes." His gaze never wavered. "You'll hang legally. That's always been the plan." The progression that followed unfolded with the deliberate care of a long-awaited resolution. Harlow, disarmed and bound, sat silently as Eleanor continued formal. Documentation of his crimes in her journal, testimony that would soon support official charges. Blackwood secured the cabin and retrieved proof of the other gang members' identities. By midday, they had begun preparations for the journey to Fort Laramie, a trip now complicated by their prisoner but made necessary by both justice and Eleanor's advancing pregnancy. The confrontation that Blackwood had pursued for years had resolved not through lone vengeance, but through unexpected partnership with the very witness Harlow had tried to eliminate. As evening approached, Eleanor found Blackwood standing at the forest edge, looking toward the makeshift graves he had created for Harlow's men. His expression remained unreadable, but the set of his shoulders suggested the complex weight of long-pursued resolution. "Are you all right?" she asked, joining him in the fading light. "Been hunting them for 5 years," he replied quietly. "Imagined their end countless ways. Never pictured it happening like this." He turned to face her, his weathered features showing vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Never thought I'd have help. Especially not from someone with more cause against them than even I had." "We both needed justice," Eleanor said simply. "Different paths brought us to the same purpose." Blackwood nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression as he studied her. "Caroline would have liked you, same kind of strength beneath a gentle appearance." The comparison, clearly the highest compliment he could offer, touched Eleanor deeply. They stood together in companionable silence as dusk gathered around the cabin, the immediate threat eliminated, but significant challenges still before them. "Tomorrow we start for Fort Laramie," Blackwood finally said. 3-day journey with Harlow slowing us. Need to get there before—" He gestured toward her advanced pregnancy. Eleanor nodded agreement, her hand automatically finding its familiar position over the child. Do you think it's over? Truly over? The threat from Harlow? Yes. Blackwood's gaze met hers directly. The challenges ahead? Those are just the beginning. The simple acknowledgement contained multiple layers. Her approaching childbirth, the legal proceedings that would follow at Fort Laramie, and the unspoken question of what might exist between them beyond their successful alliance against shared enemies. As they returned to the cabin, where their prisoner awaited transport to justice, Eleanor felt the child move strongly within her, a reminder of life continuing, despite the violence that had framed both their journeys. Something had ended today in their confrontation with Harlow, but something else had begun in its place. Something neither had anticipated when fate first drew their solitary paths together. The journey to Fort Laramie began at dawn. Eleanor sat beside Blackwood on the wagon's bench, their prisoner secured in the bed behind them. They had constructed a makeshift prison from trap chains and rope, ensuring Harlow could neither escape nor pose further threat during transit. The wagon itself represented the first fruits of their victory, recovered from Harlow's own camp, established in a hidden valley 2 miles from Blackwood's cabin. Along with the vehicle, they had claimed supplies, weapons, and several horses that would make their journey to Fort Laramie considerably more manageable than traveling on foot. "How are you feeling?" Blackwood asked as they navigated a particularly rough stretch of trail. His concern had grown more evident since the confrontation, especially regarding her advanced pregnancy. "Well enough," Eleanor replied, one hand braced against the wagon's frame for stability. "The child has been active since yesterday, perhaps responding to all the excitement." Blackwood nodded, his expression suggesting he understood the deeper implications. The shared danger they had faced, followed by unexpected triumph, had fundamentally altered their relationship. No longer simply protector and protected, they had become true allies, each contributing essential elements to their survival and success. Behind them, Harlow maintained sullen silence, his initial, taunts having faded after Blackwood's quiet but effective reminder of his precarious position. The outlaw leader clearly understood that his survival depended entirely on their intention to deliver him to proper authorities rather than enact frontier justice. The trail wound through increasingly open territory as they descended from the mountains toward the plains where Fort Laramie stood. Blackwood chose their route carefully, balancing the need for efficient travel against Eleanor's comfort and the security of their prisoner. Each evening he established camp with methodical attention to both safety and her condition, selecting level ground, creating proper bedding from available materials, ensuring she rested while he maintained vigilance. On the second night, as they sat beside their small fire, Harlow finally broke his extended silence. "You're making a mistake, Blackwood," he called from his secured position against the wagon wheel. "I've got friends at Fort Laramie, men who owe me favors or fear what I know about them." Blackwood continued, calmly preparing their meal, seemingly unperturbed by the implied threat. "Marshal Gardner isn't among them. Neither is Captain Wilson of the cavalry detachment. Marshals transfer. Captains get reassigned," Harlow countered. "Military justice moves slow and forgets quick. You really think they'll hang a former army officer on the word of a trapper and a woman?" Eleanor observed the exchange with interest, noting Harlow's attempt to create doubt and division. "They'll hang you based on evidence," she stated firmly. "My testimony, Blackwood's tracking of multiple massacre sites, and the recovered property from your camp bearing the marks of murdered families." Her confident assertion silenced Harlow temporarily. Blackwood gave her an approving glance as he handed her a plate of stew. Their quiet cooperation continued to unsettle their prisoner, who had clearly expected less competent adversaries. Later, with Harlow finally asleep and Blackwood taking first watch, Eleanor wrote in her journal by firelight, "Day 40 since the massacre, second day of journey to Fort Laramie with our prisoner. The reality of our success against Harlow remains somewhat surreal, that the architect of so much suffering now lies bound and defeated through our combined efforts. Yet victory brings its own complications. What follows justice for William and the others? What future exists for a widow with a newborn child in these territories? And what of Caleb, whose life's purpose has reached its conclusion after years of single-minded pursuit? These questions lingered unaddressed as they traveled through the third day. The terrain gradually transformed from mountain foothills to rolling prairie, signaling their approach to the more settled territories surrounding Fort Laramie. By evening, Blackwood estimated they would reach the fort by midday tomorrow if their pace remained steady. As they established their final camp before reaching civilization, Eleanor noticed increased discomfort in her lower back and abdomen, occasional tightening sensations that came and went with increasing regularity. She recognized these signs from descriptions shared by married friends and the midwife's notes Blackwood had given her. Early labor had begun. She said nothing immediately, assessing the timing between sensations and their intensity. The contractions remained mild and widely spaced, likely preliminary signs rather than imminent birth. Fort Laramie lay less than half a day's journey ahead. Mentioning her condition now would only create unnecessary concern when their focus needed to remain on securely delivering their prisoner. Blackwood, however, had grown attuned to her expressions and movements over their weeks together. As he handed her a cup of coffee, his gaze sharpened with awareness. "Something's changed," he stated rather than asked, voice low enough that Harlow couldn't overhear. Eleanor considered deflecting, but decided honesty served them better. "Early signs," she confirmed quietly. "Nothing requiring immediate attention. The midwife's notes suggest this phase can last days for first pregnancies." Concern flashed across his features. "We should increase our pace tomorrow. Reach the fort by morning if possible." "Agreed, but don't worry unnecessarily. The child seems determined to arrive in civilized surroundings rather than wilderness." Her attempt at lightness earned a brief smile that transformed Blackwood's weathered features. These moments had increased since their confrontation with Harlow, small glimpses of the man who might exist beyond the driven hunter she had first encountered. Morning brought intensified discomfort, but still manageable. Eleanor maintained steady composure as they broke camp and resumed their journey, focusing on the imminent conclusion of one chapter in their extraordinary shared story. Blackwood drove the wagon with increased urgency, finding smoother paths that reduced jostling while maintaining efficient progress. By mid-morning, the distinctive silhouette of Fort Laramie appeared on the horizon, wooden palisades and scattered buildings representing the first permanent settlement Eleanor had seen since the massacre. The sight affected her profoundly, a tangible symbol of returning to civilization after her wilderness transformation. Their arrival created an immediate sensation. A mounted patrol intercepted them a mile from the fort's gates, rifles ready until Blackwood identified himself and explained their extraordinary cargo. The patrol commander's expression shifted from suspicion to astonishment as he recognized Harlow's name and examined their secured prisoner. "The Harlow gang? You captured Frank Harlow?" His disbelief gave way to grudging respect as he ordered 2 men to ride ahead and alert the fort commander. By the time they passed through the gates, a significant crowd had gathered. Soldiers, civilians, and officials drawn by news of their arrival. Eleanor sat straight despite increasing discomfort, aware of the striking image they presented, a heavily pregnant woman and weathered trapper delivering the territory's most notorious outlaw in chains. Marshal James Gardner, a graying man with the hard eyes of someone who had witnessed frontier justice in all its forms, stepped forward as they halted before the command building. His gaze moved from Harlow to Blackwood with dawning recognition. "Caleb Blackwood," he stated, extending a hand. Heard you were hunting him. Didn't expect you'd succeed where 2 territory marshals and a cavalry company failed. Wasn't alone this time, Blackwood replied, nodding toward Eleanor as he accepted the handshake. Mrs. Eleanor Reed survived Harlow's attack on the Miller Donovan wagon train. She's the key witness and equal partner in his capture. Gardner's assessment of Eleanor carried professional respect rather than the dismissive glance many officials might offer a woman in her condition. Ma'am, you have my sincere admiration and the thanks of this territory. We've been after Harlow's gang for 3 years. Eleanor acknowledged this with a dignified nod, resisting the urge to shift position as another contraction tightened across her abdomen. We have significant evidence documenting his crimes, Marshal. I witnessed the massacre firsthand and can identify him without question. As Harlow was removed to the fort's jail under heavy guard, the fort commander, Captain Wilson, approached to offer official welcome and assistance. His expression changed to alarm when he noticed Eleanor's momentary grimace during a stronger contraction. Mrs. Reed, you appear to be in some distress. Are you injured? Not injured, Captain, she replied, with remarkable composure. But I believe your fort surgeon may be needed sooner rather than later. My child seems determined to arrive today. The statement catalyzed immediate action. Orders were issued, the fort doctor summoned, and Eleanor escorted to the commander's own residence, where his wife, Mrs. Wilson, took charge with efficient compassion. Within 30 minutes, Eleanor found herself in a proper bed for the first time since leaving her wagon home, surrounded by competent women preparing for the birth. Blackwood remained outside with the marshal, providing detailed information about Harlow's crimes and their confrontation, while casting frequent glances toward the building where Eleanor had been taken. His usual stoic expression had given way to evident concern that the marshal noted with interest. You and Mrs. Reed formed quite a partnership from what I gather, Gardner observed, as they completed the necessary documentation for Harlow's detention. Blackwood's response was characteristically understated. Circumstances created mutual need. She's an extraordinary woman, clearly. The marshal studied him with the perceptive gaze of someone accustomed to reading people. What happens after this? For both of you? The question gave Blackwood pause. In the intensity of pursuing Harlow and then securing their prisoner, the future beyond this moment had received little consideration. Eleanor's imminent childbirth added further complexity to an already uncertain situation. Haven't discussed it, he admitted. Taking each challenge as it comes seemed most practical. Gardner nodded, understanding. Territories changing fast, settlers pushing in everywhere, new communities forming. Woman like that with her courage and capabilities would be welcome in any of them. He left the implied question hanging between them, whether Blackwood intended to remain part of whatever future Eleanor chose. Inside the commander's residence, Eleanor's labor progressed with increasing intensity. The fort surgeon, Dr. Adams, provided professional reassurance after his initial examination. Everything appears normal, Mrs. Reed. First babies typically take their time, but you're young and healthy despite your extraordinary ordeal. Mrs. Wilson, a motherly woman who had assisted at numerous births within the fort community, provided practical support and encouragement. You're doing beautifully, my dear, far better than many women I've attended who haven't faced half your challenges. The contrast between these comfortable surroundings and the wilderness birth Eleanor had feared struck her forcefully during brief respites between contractions. From survival alone in the ravine, to Wolf Den, to Blackwood's cabin, to this organized medical support, her journey had traced an improbable arc from utmost vulnerability to remarkable security. As afternoon stretched toward evening, labor intensified. Eleanor focused inward, drawing on the same determination that had carried her through weeks of wilderness survival. The skills learned in that crucible patience, endurance, acceptance of pain as temporary condition served her well in the birthing room. Outside, Blackwood maintained steadfast vigil despite multiple suggestions that he get rest or refreshment. His usual mountain independence had given way to an uncharacteristic need to remain close, though propriety prevented his direct presence in the birthing room. Captain Wilson eventually joined him, offering a flask of whiskey and tacit understanding. "First, child is always the hardest to wait," the captain observed. "Been through it twice myself." Blackwood accepted the flask with a nod of thanks. Never expected to experience this particular wait at all. Wilson studied him with the assessing gaze of a commander accustomed to judging men's character. Life takes unexpected trails sometimes. Question is whether we have the courage to follow where they lead. The philosophical observation hung between them as darkness settled over the fort. Lamps were lit, sentries changed, and still the wait continued. Occasionally, Mrs. Wilson emerged with brief updates that Blackwood received with controlled intensity. "Progressing well, stronger contractions now. The doctor is pleased with her condition." Near midnight, the distinctive cry of a newborn finally pierced the night air, vigorous and clear. Blackwood's head jerked up from where he had been, staring into the small fire pit outside the residence. Captain Wilson clapped him on the shoulder with genuine warmth. "Congratulations are in order, I believe, regardless of the exact circumstances." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Wilson appeared in the doorway, her tired face wreathed in smiles. "Mrs. Reed has delivered a healthy daughter. Both mother and child are doing remarkably well." She hesitated, then added, "She's asking for you, Mr. Blackwood." "Most irregular, but given the extraordinary circumstances." Blackwood followed her into the residence with uncharacteristic uncertainty. The trapper, who had tracked Harlow's gang across multiple territories without hesitation, now moved with careful restraint, as if entering territory far more intimidating than any wilderness. The bedroom had been transformed into a proper recovery space, with clean linens and soft lamplight creating a gentle atmosphere. Eleanor sat propped against pillows, her face showing exhaustion, but also a radiance Blackwood had never witnessed. In her arms lay a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. "Caleb," she greeted him, using his first name without hesitation. "Come meet her." He approached with visible caution, standing awkwardly beside the bed until Eleanor shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket to reveal the infant's face. The child was remarkably alert, dark blue eyes blinking against the lamplight. Tiny features, perfectly formed beneath a dusting of dark hair. "She's beautiful," he said simply, the plain-spoken assessment carrying more weight than flowery compliments might have. "I've named her Hope," Eleanor told him, a meaningful choice that acknowledged both what had sustained her through their ordeal and what now lay before them. Hope Caroline Reed. The middle name, his wife's name, caught Blackwood completely off guard. Emotion crossed his weathered features before he could mask it with his usual stoicism. "It's a good name," he finally managed. "Strong." Eleanor's gaze held his steadily. "I wanted to honor the connection that brought us here, all the way from that wolf den to this moment. Without Caroline's memory driving you to hunt Harlow, without her midwife sister's notes guiding us, this child might never have survived to birth." The recognition of these intertwined fates, how tragedy had ultimately led to preservation, created a profound moment between them. Mrs. Wilson and the doctor had tactfully withdrawn, leaving them in temporary privacy that allowed unguarded conversation. "What happens now?" Blackwood asked, echoing the marshal's earlier question, but with deeper personal significance. Eleanor considered carefully before answering. "First, justice concludes. My testimony ensures Harlow faces proper punishment for all he's done. To the Miller-Donovan party, to your Caroline, to everyone he's harmed. And after justice," Blackwood pressed gently, That depends partly on you. Her directness matched his own typical approach. My original destination was Oregon Territory, but circumstances have changed everything. William is gone. I'm alone with an infant daughter. The future I planned no longer exists. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, unused to conversations involving potential futures rather than immediate survival. Fort Laramie would welcome you. Captain Wilson mentioned they need a school teacher for the settlement children. Is that what you think I should do? Remain here while you return to your mountain solitude? There was no accusation in her tone, only honest inquiry. The question forced Blackwood to confront what he had been avoiding, the profound change in his own circumstances. With Harlow captured and justice imminent, the driving purpose of his existence for 5 years had reached a conclusion. The solitary life that had suited his grief and mission now stretched before him strangely empty of meaning. My cabin would need significant improvements, he said finally, the practical statement containing layers of deeper meaning. Proper addition for a family, better roof, glass windows instead of oilskin. Eleanor's expression softened with understanding. Ah, you suggesting modifications to your home or to your life, Caleb? Both, I think. His gaze moved from her to the infant and back again. Been alone a long time, got used to it. But these weeks together, facing what we faced, changes a man's thinking. Hope squirmed in Eleanor's arms, tiny fingers emerging from the blanket to wave randomly in the air. Blackwood found himself extending one finger toward the movement, surprised when the infant grasped it with surprising strength. Not suggesting anything immediate, he clarified quickly. You've your own choices to make, your own grief still. Fresh, just possibilities worth considering, perhaps, when you're ready. Eleanor's smile held both understanding and appreciation for his careful approach. Possibilities are precisely what I need right now. After believing all possibilities had ended with the massacre, finding new ones feels like an unexpected gift. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Adams, returning to check on mother and child. Blackwood withdrew slightly, reclaiming his usual reserve in the presence of others. The doctor's examination confirmed both Eleanor and Hope were doing remarkably well, despite the circumstances preceding the birth. You'll need at least 2 weeks' recovery here before considering travel of any kind, Adams advised Eleanor firmly. Frontier births can be surprisingly straightforward, but proper healing takes time regardless. 2 weeks also ensures you'll be here for Harlow's preliminary hearing, Marshal Gardner added from the doorway, where he had appeared to offer congratulations. Judge Parker arrives by month's end for the circuit court. Your testimony will be crucial. The reminder of unfinished business grounded their temporary euphoria in practical reality. Justice required completion before new beginnings could truly commence. Eleanor nodded understanding, her expression resolute despite her exhaustion. I'll be ready, Marshal. This child deserves to enter a world where her father's murderer has faced proper judgment. As night deepened around Fort Laramie, Eleanor finally succumbed to much-needed sleep, Hope secured in a makeshift cradle beside her bed. Blackwood maintained his vigil outside, declining offers of proper quarters to remain within calling distance should they need him. Under starlight that seemed somehow brighter than during their wilderness journey. He contemplated the extraordinary transformation of his existence. From solitary hunter consumed by vengeance to potential family man considering a shared future, the path had been neither planned nor anticipated, yet felt strangely right despite its challenges. The carved wooden rabbit he had created weeks earlier rested in his pocket, waiting for the appropriate moment to present to Hope. Its creation had been instinctive rather than calculated, perhaps his subconscious recognizing possibilities his conscious mind hadn't yet accepted. 3 weeks later, as summer warmth gave way to early autumn crispness, a small gathering assembled in Fort Laramie's modest church. Eleanor stood beside Blackwood, hope cradled in her arms, as Judge Parker officiated two significant ceremonies in succession: the sentencing of Frank Harlow to hang for his numerous murders, and the marriage of Caleb Blackwood to Eleanor Reed. The juxtaposition of ending and beginning seemed fitting to those who had followed their extraordinary story. Justice completed, grief honored, and new life affirmed, each element balancing the others in a manner that acknowledged both the darkness they had survived and the light they had discovered through their unlikely alliance. As they departed the fort afterward, bound for Blackwood's cabin with supplies for the significant improvements already planned, Eleanor paused at the settlement's edge, looking back at civilization, then forward toward the wilderness that had nearly claimed her, yet ultimately provided an unexpected sanctuary. She recognized the unique path that had delivered her to this moment. Having second thoughts, Blackwood asked, genuine concern in his voice as he halted the wagon. "No," Eleanor replied truthfully, "just appreciating the journey from Wolf Den to here. Who could have predicted such a path?" Hope slept peacefully against her chest, secure in her mother's embrace, and unaware of the extraordinary circumstances of her entry into the world. Blackwood studied them both with an expression that had gradually softened from the hard vigilance of a vengeance-driven hunter to something more complex and human. "The mountains look different now," he observed as they continued their journey. "Same peaks, same valleys, but I'm seeing them through changed eyes." Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. Her own perception had transformed. The wilderness no longer represented merely threat and survival, but also strength discovered, skills developed, and connections formed that defied conventional understanding. "We carry both worlds now," she said thoughtfully, "what the wilderness taught us and what civilization offers. Hope will need both to thrive in these territories." As their wagon followed the familiar trail toward the cabin that would become a proper home, Eleanor felt the integration of her experiences solidifying into something cohesive and powerful. The woman who had crawled into a wolf's den to escape massacre had emerged not just a survivor, but a creator of new possibilities for herself, for her daughter, and for the solitary man whose parallel journey had intersected with hers. Against all probability, the future remained uncertain in many ways. Frontier life guaranteed no easy paths or assured outcomes. Yet the skills that had carried them through extraordinary challenges would serve equally well in building something meaningful. From tragedy's aftermath, like the wilderness itself, their story contained both harsh realities and unexpected beauty, both brutal loss and remarkable resilience. Hope stirred against Eleanor's chest, tiny hands reaching upward, as if already eager to explore the world awaiting her. Blackwood's gaze met Eleanor's over their daughter's movements, shared understanding passing between them without need for words. They had both lost everything that mattered, survived against impossible odds, found justice for those taken from them, and now faced the most challenging journey of all, creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Together they turned toward the mountain horizon, ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.